Anton Malay, rings accident. On July 15, 1930, 23-year-old Slovenian gymnast Anton Malay entered the World Championships in Luxembourg under unusual circumstances. Rain had soaked the main venue, forcing organizers to shift the competition into a cramped school gym with hastily arranged apparatus and mats that were noticeably too thin for elite activity. Malay began his rings routine normally, lifting into long, controlled swings. But the rings had been mounted unevenly in the rush to relocate, leaving one slightly higher and angled differently. As Malay pulled into an inverted strength position, the imbalance made his rings drift apart, subtly at first, then suddenly enough to pull his shoulders offline. Trying to correct mid-movement only increased the sway. His hands slipped as the rings jerked, and within a second he fell straight down from several feet in the air. He landed on his upper back and neck, the thin mat offering almost no cushioning. The impact stunned the room. Witnesses later said the landing was so flat and heavy that it didn't even sound like a fall, just a single dull thud. Medical staff rushed over, but the spinal damage was catastrophic. Malay was taken to the hospital and died shortly afterward. A slightly misaligned setup and insufficient matting during an improvised relocation turned an otherwise routine ring sequence into a fatal accident. Julissa Gomez, vaulting crash. In May 1988, 15-year-old American gymnast Julissa Gomez was warming up for the vault at an international meet in Tokyo, preparing a Yurchenko entry, a skill that begins with a sprint, then a blind back handspring onto the springboard before blocking off the vault table. The move demands perfect spacing and timing, because once the gymnast commits to the backward takeoff, she cannot adjust her angle. During one run, Julissa's steps brought her slightly too close to the springboard. When she initiated the back handspring, her hands struck the board at the wrong angle, sending her upward without enough rotation. The vault table rushed toward her as she tried to catch air she no longer had room for. She collided headfirst with the table, her neck absorbing the full force. The impact instantly severed spinal function, and Julissa collapsed motionless. She was stabilized and transported back to the U.S. for long-term care, but the injury had left her permanently paralyzed. Over the next 3 years, she suffered recurring infections caused by the initial trauma, and in 1991, one of those complications proved fatal. Everything that followed began with that single miscalculated step, a tiny adjustment that turned one of gymnastics' most technical vaults into an irreversible catastrophe. Elena Mukina, Thomas Salto training accident. On July 3, 1980, 20-year-old Soviet gymnast Elena Mukina was in Moscow performing final preparations for the Olympic Games, training the Thomas Salto, a tumbling move that required enormous rotational speed, a backward 1.5 somersault followed by a blind forward rollout. The element had virtually no room for error. If the gymnast didn't generate enough height or rotation, the body would come down head first. During one repetition, Mukina's takeoff was slightly underpowered. She rose into the air but stalled mid-rotation, her body starting to fold forward while still upside down. There was no way to twist out or break the fall. Once the salto under-rotated, she was committed to landing on whatever part of her body made contact first. She struck the mat on her head and neck, collapsing instantly under the impact. The injury shattered vertebrae and left her completely paralyzed. Although she survived the initial trauma and lived for many years afterward, her paralysis caused a chain of medical complications that eventually led to her death in 2006. The accident stemmed entirely from one mistimed takeoff on a skill that offered no safe margin once the rotation failed. A split-second difference between a completed element and a life-ending injury. Ricky Desi, sudden cardiac collapse. On October 11, 2001, 13-year-old junior national gymnast Ricky Desi was training at the U.S. Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, running through a routine conditioning circuit after pommel horse practice. The intensity of the session was typical for national-level training, high repetition strength cycles followed by endurance holds meant to push athletes to their limits. Desi seemed fine through the final round and stepped away from the equipment to reset. Moments later, he unexpectedly collapsed onto the floor. Coaches immediately called for medical staff who began CPR within seconds. There were no signs of a fall, head strike, or any external trauma. He had simply dropped where he stood. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, but doctors were unable to revive him. Medical reports later determined that Ricky had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest, likely caused by an undetected heart abnormality that produced a fatal electrical disturbance during exertion. The event unfolded so quickly that there was no visible lead-up. One moment he was finishing a conditioning set, and the next his heart had stopped. It remains one of the rare gymnastics deaths not caused by apparatus, impact, or miscalculation, but by a hidden medical condition triggered during routine elite training. Melanie Coleman, uneven bars slip. On November 8, 2019, 20-year-old NCAA gymnast Melanie Coleman was practicing uneven bars at New Era Gymnastics in Connecticut, working on a transition that required her to release the high bar and regrip the low bar while maintaining speed and alignment. The transition itself is common, but it relies completely on grip security. Any slip during the release sends the gymnast into a fall with no opportunity to correct the body's rotation. As Melanie initiated the move, her right hand lost contact with the bar, and the swing that should have carried her toward the low bar instead sent her backward with her body stretched out and unable to reorient. She fell from the high bar height, landing on her upper back and neck. The force of the impact caused a severe spinal cord injury, and she was transported to Yale New Haven Hospital. Despite emergency treatment, the damage was irreversible and she died 2 days later. The entire event lasted less than a second. A single hand slip during a routine transition that instantly removed all control and turned a standard training repetition into a fatal fall.